Welcome to This Explainer, where we're going to unpack the structural, psychological, and historical reasons why deep intelligence is so often mistaken for sheer incompetence. You know, there's this quiet horror that most deep thinkers eventually run into. They speak, and the room just kind of nods slowly, almost the way you'd nod at a little kid who confused the names of two countries. They aren't being mocked, really. They're just being tolerated. So, let's dive right into this by asking a question that might feel incredibly familiar, especially if you've ever been talked over in a meeting. Why is it that in a crowded room, the genius and the simpleton often look practically identical? Because from the outside, they both pause a little too long. They both refuse the obvious answer. They both seem to be standing just slightly outside the normal flow of conversation. Friedrich Nietzsche actually hit the nail on the head here. He pointed out that the masses simply cannot distinguish between intelligence that is way too far behind and intelligence that is way too far ahead. Honestly, from the middle of the pack, both directions look exactly the same. The genius is aiming at a target that no one else in the room can even see, which means to everyone else, it looks like they're aiming at absolutely nothing. To really understand why this happens, we're going to explore 6 specific laws that explain this social phenomenon. But to anchor our whole journey today, I want you to keep a certain story in the back of your mind. Just picture a doctor in a Vienna hospital back in 1847. He was about to discover exactly how dark the cost of brilliance can get. We'll get back to him in a bit, but first we need to understand the fundamental rules of the room. Okay, Law 1, the illusion of stupidity. Let's look at how slowness basically wears the costume of stupidity. Because if you watch a fast-paced room have a fast-paced conversation, the instinct of that room is absolutely always to credit the quick thinkers and dismiss the ones who hesitate. You might be familiar with Nobel laureate Daniel Kahneman's model of the brain, which explains this perfectly. He divided the human mind into 2 engines. System 1 is fast, automatic, and shallow. It's basically just pattern matching. System 2, on the other hand, is slow, deliberate, it holds multiple variables, and it's metabolically expensive. The issue is, the room rewards the cheap speed of System 1 and completely misreads the deliberate pause of a System 2 thinker as confusion. The listeners can't see the mental orchestra warming up inside your head. They just hear a gap of silence and immediately assume, oh, they don't know the answer. Which brings us to this Bertrand Russell quote from 1933. And man, this isn't just a funny joke. It's a literal, structural law of social life. Confidence is incredibly cheap to manufacture, and it's super easy to read. But nuance? Nuance is expensive to produce and almost impossible to display in real time. Deep thinkers are often terrified that the room will grab a flattened, dangerous version of their idea. So they add caveats, they layer their thoughts. But the room just hears those layers as hesitation, smiles politely, and moves on to whoever is being the loudest. Moving right along to Law 2, the translation tax. This one operates completely invisibly underneath the first law, and it explains why brilliant ideas so often just die in transit. Think about it like this. When a deep thinker has a thought, it arrives in super high resolution. But for anyone else to actually hear it, they have to pay this translation tax. This was formalized in 1989 as the curse of knowledge. Basically, the thinker has to take this subtle, complex thought and compress it into blunt, low-resolution statements for the room. And when that compression happens, the translation loses the exact nuance that made the thought worth sharing in the first place. The philosopher Schopenhauer pointed out a massive disconnect here. He argued that the genius is looking at the overarching type, the big picture, but the room is only focused on the specific, individual example right in front of them. So when the genius speaks, the room just hears a weird claim that doesn't match their immediate example and they reject it. This is exactly why the most profound correct objection in a meeting gets shelved, only to blow up as a massive crisis 3 months later. All right, Law 3, arriving too early. This one is deeply rooted in Nietzsche's old parable of the madman who runs into a marketplace with a lantern in broad daylight. The crowd just laughs at him because his urgency seems totally absurd to them. The tragic reality here is that being correct before the room is ready for it is functionally indistinguishable from just being insane. Take Alfred Wegener, for example. Back in 1912, he was a meteorologist who proposed the idea of continental drift. The geological establishment didn't just disagree with him, they mocked him personally because he wasn't a real geologist, and his idea offended their common sense. He died in 1930, completely rejected. And it took 3 full decades after his death for plate tectonics to become the absolute foundation of the very science that laughed him out of the room. Or look at the geneticist Barbara McClintock in the late 1940s. Her perception was so far ahead of our era that when she presented evidence of moving genes, her own colleagues literally called her work mystical and confusing. It got so bad she had to stop publishing her main findings and worked in near isolation for over 30 years. The room finally caught up in 1983, awarding her a Nobel Prize at the age of 81. The lightning had struck, but the thunder took decades to arrive. And the social cost of this? It is absolutely staggering. Back in 1951, Solomon Asch ran these famous conformity experiments. He found that roughly 3/4 of people would literally deny the obvious evidence of their own eyes regarding the length of a line just to stay accepted by the room. That shows you the brutal cost of being the only person who sees what is actually there. And it's a cost the genius pays permanently. Which brings us to Law 4, the refusal to perform. As we go deeper into this psychological cave, we hit this idea of refusing to perform a slightly dumber, strategically rounded version of yourself. You know, most smart people eventually learn to just play the game. They simplify their vocabulary, they round their opinions down. But true genius? It often flat out refuses to do this. History actually gives us a brilliant illustration of what happens when an intellect refuses to perform for a hostile room. In 1935, a 24-year-old Indian physicist named Chandrasekhar mathematically proved that what we now call black holes actually exist. But Arthur Eddington, who was the most respected astrophysicist at the time, publicly humiliated him and called the result absurd. Now, Chandrasekhar didn't retreat. He didn't soften his language to appease Eddington. He kept his unrounded result entirely intact. But he paid a severe 30-year professional price in crushed funding just to avoid that self-erasure. Ultimately, of course, he won the Nobel Prize. Now we hit Law 5, the Cassandra curve. And this is where we finally loop back to our doctor in Vienna to uncover where this mechanism of rejection takes its absolute darkest turn. His name was Ignaz Semmelweis. In 1846, he noticed this horrifying discrepancy in the hospital's maternity wards. Clinic 1, which was staffed by doctors who performed autopsies, had a massive 18% mortality rate. But Clinic 2, staffed by midwives who didn't perform autopsies, sat at just 2%. Semmelweis proposed that invisible cadaverous particles were basically being carried from the corpses straight to the women. So he instituted a really simple chlorinated hand-washing policy, and the results were undeniable. The mortality rate in the doctor's clinic immediately plummeted down to match the midwives' 2%. The data was literally the cleanest ever produced on the subject. But here's the crazy part. His colleagues completely rejected it. Why on earth would they reject that? Well, because accepting his truth required a confession that the room was totally unwilling to make. If Semmelweis was right, it meant these doctors had been accidentally killing the very women they were trying to save for decades. And the room will pay any rhetorical price to keep an unbearable truth out. They mocked his mannerisms, they called him unstable, they isolated him. He was eventually committed to an asylum, beaten, and tragically died of an infection at just 47. You see, he didn't appear stupid because his data was weak. He appeared stupid because his truth fundamentally threatened the establishment's ego. And that leads us directly to our final law, Law 6, the unbearable mirror. This is the deepest structural reason for this whole social cost. The masses do not punish the genius for being wrong. They punish them for being a mirror. You know Plato's famous allegory of the cave, right? A prisoner escapes, sees the real world, and comes back to free the others. But they don't thank him. They mock his ruined eyes because he can no longer see their shadows clearly in the dark. Plato warned that if they could get their hands on him, they would literally kill him, because the freed prisoner's existence threatens everyone else by proving their reality is small. When faced with someone clearly sharper, an average room has a really psychologically expensive choice. They can adjust their ego downward, or they can just call the genius arrogant, weird, and cracked. And they almost always choose the latter. They'd rather crack the mirror than look into it.
All right, let's wrap this up. The 6 laws of social cost, the slowness that looks like stupidity, the translation tax, arriving too early, the refusal to perform, the Cassandra curve, and the unbearable mirror. If you have ever had your thoughtful pause read as stupidity, or watched a highly accurate observation get shelved and then stolen 3 years later, you've experienced the friction of these laws firsthand. You've felt the pressure to perform a rounder, simpler version of yourself just to survive in the room.
Look, most people faced with this price just learn to quietly round themselves down. They undergo this slow, invisible self-erasure just to fit in socially. But Nietzsche had a very clear final warning about this. He said, "Do not become small to be permitted near them." The cost of belonging to the herd is sacrificing the exact part of your intellect that made your belonging worth offering in the first place. So the lingering question here isn't about whether the world is fair to its sharpest minds. History shows us it absolutely never has been. The real question you have to ask yourself today is this: are you shrinking your intellect and silencing your deepest thoughts to appease a room that is psychologically desperate to misunderstand you? Really think about it. Thanks for joining me on this explainer. Keep thinking deeply, and whatever you do, refuse to become small.